She had 300 people in that ballroom watching her every move, and not one of them was on her side. Sienna Whitmore had built her company from nothing, survived every boardroom war, every hostile negotiation, every sleepless quarter where the numbers didn't add up. She knew how to read a room. And standing beneath the chandeliers of the Alderton Grand on the night of the biggest deal of her career, surrounded by champagne glasses and congratulations, she felt the cold, quiet certainty that she was about to disappear. The men guarding her were not her men, and nobody in that room was going to help her except the one person nobody would ever suspect. If this kind of story keeps you up at night, the quiet heroes, the impossible nights, the truth that refuses to stay buried, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Alderton Grand Hotel rose 42 floors above the downtown skyline, and on a clear night you could see it from the highway like a lit candle standing apart from everything around it. The ballroom on the 4th floor had been booked for 6 weeks. Invitations had gone out to 312 people, investors, board members, legal partners, journalists from 2 financial publications, and a carefully curated guest list that Sienna Whitmore's communications team had spent the better part of a month assembling. Tonight was supposed to be the night, the Nova Bridge merger. 4 years of quiet negotiation, 3 collapsed deals before this one, 2 rounds of investor panic, and 1 stretch of 62 consecutive days where Sienna had flown between cities on 4 hours of sleep and whatever food appeared in front of her on the plane. The merger would position Whitmore Technologies as one of the dominant mid-market enterprise platforms in North America. It would mean 700 new jobs, a valuation jump that would make her earliest investors weep with relief, and something harder to quantify, the proof that she had been right all along, when everyone told her the company was too small to survive. She had worn the navy dress for exactly this night. Her assistant had sent 3 options to the hotel suite. Sienna had looked at them for approximately 45 seconds and chosen the one that said, "I am not celebrating yet," because she wasn't. Not until the ink dried. The ballroom was already full when she came down at 7:45. String quartet in the corner. Waitstaff moving with practiced smoothness between clusters of guests. The light from the chandeliers bounced off crystal and caught the silver edges of the centerpieces, and for a moment, just a moment, Sienna let herself feel what the night was supposed to feel like. Then she spotted the first man. He was standing near the corridor entrance that led toward the executive elevator bank. Dark suit, white earpiece wire running behind his right ear, the slight forward lean of a man who is watching exits rather than guests. Sienna recognized 2 of her own security team from the corner of her eye, Garrett near the main doors, Priya at the far end of the room, and this man was neither of them. She had personally reviewed the security rotation that afternoon, with her head of protection, Marcus, who was stationed outside the signing room, upstairs. She knew her people. This was not one of her people. She kept moving, shook a hand, smiled at something a board member said, accepted a glass of sparkling water. She had no intention of drinking and used it as a prop to shift her position 40 degrees, casual, unhurried, so she could see the corridor from a different angle. There was a second man at the far end of the hall. Same posture, same practiced stillness. His eyes didn't follow the movement of the guests the way you'd expect from someone genuinely working crowd security. They followed her. Sienna set the glass down on a passing tray. 3 days earlier, she had received an email to a private address that very few people knew existed. A single line: delay the signing. You're surrounded. No sender name. The address had been a throwaway, untraceable by the time her IT team looked at it 40 minutes later. She had reported it to Marcus, who had quietly doubled the team and run background checks on every contracted vendor in the hotel. Nothing flagged. Marcus had told her it was likely corporate mischief, a rival trying to spook her before the signing. She had almost believed him. She moved toward the beverage station near the east wall, keeping her pace measured. A woman near the elevators caught her attention. Mid-30s, dressed as a hotel guest, champagne in hand, but her thumb was pressed to the side of her wrist in the specific way people press when they're keying a concealed transmitter. Her lips barely moved as she turned slightly away from the room. Sienna felt the cold move through her chest. 3 of them, at least. She knew with the specific clarity of someone who has run enough crisis scenarios to recognize the real thing that she could not go back to Marcus. If Marcus had run those checks and these people still got into position, then either Marcus had missed something, Or Marcus was part of what she'd missed. She couldn't afford to guess wrong. She had maybe minutes before whatever was planned moved from preparation to execution. Her phone was in her clutch. She thought about calling someone, then thought about the email "you're surrounded" and realized she didn't know who surrounded her. Her board? Her security contractor? Someone she'd trusted for years? She didn't know the shape of the threat yet, and calling the wrong person was worse than calling no one. The ballroom was full of 300 people who would not understand what was happening until it was already over. She needed someone with no stake in any of this. Someone who wasn't connected to her company, her security team, her board, or her deals. Someone who knew this building. She turned slowly, scanning the room with the expression of a CEO looking for a specific guest, and her eyes moved past the bar, past the string quartet, past the cluster of investors near the window, and landed on the man in the hotel uniform, standing near the side corridor entrance, with a radio clipped to his belt. She didn't know his name. She had seen him twice before, once last month when she'd held a smaller dinner here, and he'd quietly resolved a catering problem before it became visible to anyone. And once 3 days ago when she'd arrived for a pre-event walkthrough, and he'd been adjusting something near the mechanical room doors, with the focused patience of someone who understood exactly how a building worked. He was lean, a little over 6 feet, with the kind of stillness in his body that you didn't usually find in hospitality staff. She'd noticed it, the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit its category. Right now, he was the only person in the room she could approach, without the fake guards reading it as a threat response. She started moving. Not directly. She angled toward the bar first, then shifted, making it look like she was drifting the way people drift at crowded events. She was close enough to see the name stitched on his chest, Knox, when she passed him. She didn't stop, didn't look directly at him. She leaned slightly as she moved past, close enough that her words were under the noise of the room. "Help me." 2 words. That was all. Then she kept walking, stopping 3 steps later to speak with a woman she recognized from the Nova Bridge legal team. Knox Bellamy had been on shift since 4 in the afternoon and had approximately 90 minutes left before the ballroom crew would start breaking down the perimeter setup. He was managing the event from the operational side, coordinating the service staff timing, keeping the kitchen handoffs on schedule, making sure the freight elevator stayed clear for the catering overflow. It was the kind of work that required a specific kind of attention. You had to see the whole room without looking like you were watching it. He was very good at that. He caught the woman's voice as she passed. 2 words, low and level, the tone of someone who was controlling the delivery very deliberately. He recognized that kind of voice. It was not panic. It was worse than panic. Panic was noisy and visible. This was the sound of someone who was still functioning at full capacity while holding something that could break them. He didn't turn after her. He looked at the room. He'd already clocked the man near the corridor entrance. He'd been there for 40 minutes and hadn't spoken to any of the actual event security, hadn't made a single radio call, hadn't moved to check the perimeter. Knox had noted it the way he noted everything, without urgency, without reaction, filed away. He'd assumed it was a private bodyguard who hadn't coordinated with the hotel properly. That happened sometimes. He looked again now with different eyes. He found the second man in 11 seconds, and the woman near the elevators in another 4. His chest didn't tighten. His breathing didn't change. His body knew what this was before his mind finished naming it. These 3 were not protecting anyone in this ballroom. They were waiting. They had positions. Corridor entrance, far exit, elevator bank, a triangle covering the 3 main routes out of the room. Someone had planned where to stand in advance, which meant someone had a floor plan, which meant this was organized. Knox looked at his watch. 7 p.m. He looked at the woman in the navy dress, who was laughing at something the woman from the legal team had said. The laugh didn't reach her eyes. Her shoulders were still. She was buying time. Knox set down his radio very calmly on a nearby cart. He pulled out his own phone, typed a message to Denise, the duty manager, "Cover my radio for 20. Issue with service corridor B." Then he moved. He didn't go straight to the woman. He went to the kitchen corridor first, spoke briefly with the catering captain about a fictional timing adjustment, and used the 90 seconds it bought him to confirm what he'd seen. The man near the corridor hadn't moved, but he'd shifted his weight, anticipating. The woman near the elevator had turned 2 degrees, tracking the navy dress. Knox came out of the kitchen corridor with a hotel uniform jacket folded over his arm. He moved toward the woman in the navy dress from an angle that put a group of investors between him and the two men. He reached her from behind her right shoulder. He didn't make a production of it. His voice was low and completely flat. Don't turn around. Don't look at me. He let a beat pass. Are you the reason those three people are holding positions at your exits? A pause, then quietly, yes. Do you have a phone on you? In my clutch. Leave it on the bar when we pass it. Don't put it in your pocket. Don't give it to anyone, just leave it. You can tell me why in a minute. He kept his own voice level, like he was discussing the catering schedule. There's a service corridor door 12 feet ahead on your left. It looks like a wall panel. I'm going to open it. Walk through it without hurrying. Can you do that? Another pause. Shorter this time. Yes. Okay. He moved into position beside her, 2 inches behind her right shoulder, like a staff member escorting a guest towards something they'd asked for. And for what it's worth, he added, quieter, you've got about 90 seconds before the one near the corridor moves. So let's not use all of them talking. Sienna Whitmore set her clutch on the bar and left her phone inside it without breaking stride. Knox reached the panel door and pressed the release mechanism with one hand while his body blocked the sightline from the elevator woman. The door swung inward, smooth and silent. He gestured once. Sienna stepped through. He followed, pulled the door behind them, and stood very still in the dim service corridor while he listened. Footsteps on the ballroom side, movement not yet urgent. He looked at her. She was standing with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she was breathing with the focused steadiness of someone who had decided that falling apart was a thing she would do later. Maybe, if she had time. Knox, he said. I run night operations. Sienna, she said. I run a software company. She glanced down the corridor. Who are those people? I don't know yet. He already had his secondary radio in his hand, the building management frequency, separate from the event channel. But I know they're not yours. He turned and started moving down the corridor. He didn't invite her to follow because there was nothing to invite. There was one direction that made sense. She kept up. You left your radio, she said, after 10 steps. I know. You left it on purpose. If I have it, they can monitor the channel. He glanced back once. You left your phone. You told me to. I know. I'm asking if you understand why. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Tracking device. Or they can be listening through it. Either. Both. He stopped at an intersection of corridors, listened, then turned left. Tell me who knew your movements tonight. Every person. She started talking. Her voice was even. She was organized about it, listing names and roles without meandering, and Knox listened to all of it while he moved them deeper into the service network of the hotel, away from the ballroom, away from the elevators, toward the infrastructure levels where guests never went and staff only visited when something broke. She told him about the email. Delay the signing. You're surrounded. He didn't respond immediately. You reported it, he said finally. To my head of security, Marcus. And then the check back clean. Yes. And Marcus is where right now? She understood what he was asking. Upstairs. Outside the signing room. Knox stopped at a maintenance elevator and pressed the call button. The elevator was slow. They used it for equipment. It would take 40 seconds to arrive. I need you to think carefully, he said, keeping his voice low. Not about who you trust. About who knew things that only someone close to you could know. Sienna looked at him. In the flat service lighting of the corridor, without the chandeliers and the polished surfaces, she looked exactly like what she was a person standing in a concrete hallway in a navy dress, trying to keep a grip on something that had already started coming apart. She didn't look like a CEO who had everything handled. She looked like someone who had figured out, finally, that handled and safe were not the same thing. I've been asking myself that for 3 days, she said. The elevator arrived. Knox held the door and looked both directions down the corridor before stepping in. Then we have somewhere to start, he said. They rode up, 1 floor and down 2, because Knox had learned, over years of running operations in buildings like this, that the people who planned things from the outside always forgot about the buildings themselves, the old shafts and unused rooms and service passages that existed in the space between what was visible and what was functional. Those forgotten spaces were the ones that kept you alive. The fake guards were still in the ballroom, waiting for a woman who was no longer there. And Knox was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The maintenance elevator smelled like machine oil and old rubber, and it moved with the unhurried grinding slowness of something that had never been asked to hurry. Knox stood near the panel and watched the floor numbers change, while Sienna stood 2 feet to his left with her arms at her sides. and neither of them spoke for the first 30 seconds because there was nothing useful to say yet. And Knox had never been a man who filled silence just to fill it. The elevator stopped at sublevel 2. Knox stepped out first, checked the corridor in both directions, then gestured for her to follow. The sublevel was where the hotel kept its mechanical infrastructure, the HVAC units, the water mains, the electrical panels that ran the building's lighting grid. It was loud in a low, constant way, the kind of noise that swallowed other sounds, which was exactly why Knox had brought them here. The fake guards upstairs were working on event frequency, probably, and the mechanical noise would create enough interference to complicate any directional listening equipment they might carry. He'd been running buildings for 4 years. He knew where the dead zones were. "They'll know I'm gone in the next few minutes," Sienna said. She wasn't panicking. Her voice was the same measured register it had been in the corridor upstairs, but there was an edge underneath it now, not fear exactly. More like the sound of someone doing the math on a problem and not liking what the numbers kept returning. "The signing is at 9:30. When I don't appear, they'll start moving." "I know." Knox stopped at a junction and pulled out a folded floor schematic from the emergency kit mounted on the wall. He spread it against the pipe housing. "That gives us about an hour before the timing becomes critical. Less if whoever's running this decides to accelerate." "Whoever's running this." She said it slowly, tasting the shape of it. "You believe me." He looked up from the schematic. "You came to me with 2 words and no explanation in a room full of people you could have screamed at. You left your phone without arguing. You answered questions in order without embellishing." He folded the schematic back. "Yeah, I believe you." Sienna exhaled not with relief, but with the specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying something alone for 3 days and had finally been allowed to set it down for a moment. Most people would think I was paranoid. Most people didn't see what I saw in that ballroom. He started moving again. "Tell me about the email. The exact wording, delay the signing. You're surrounded. That's all. Sent to which address?" "My private one. Not the corporate account. Not the public contact. The one I use for," she paused, "for people I actually know." "Which means whoever sent it either had access to your personal contact data or was someone already in that circle." "Yes." She followed him around a corner past a row of secondary boiler tanks. "My IT director said the sending address was created 12 hours before the email arrived and deleted immediately after. Completely clean. Someone who knew how to cover a digital footprint," Knox said. "And they warned you instead of just letting whatever this is happen. That means there's at least one person inside who doesn't want you gone." Sienna hadn't thought about it from that angle. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been so focused on who's against me that I didn't think about who tried to help me. Worth thinking about later." He stopped at a heavy door marked restricted electrical access and pulled out the master key card from his belt. "Right now I need to think about where to put you while I make a call." She looked at the door, then at him. "What kind of call?" "Someone who can run digital traces faster than your IT team and without leaving the same footprints." He pushed the door open. The room beyond was full of breaker panels and cable runs and a single metal stool in the corner that had no business being there. "I worked with him a long time ago. Different line of work. Before hotel operations," Sienna said. It wasn't a question. Knox held the door and looked at her steadily. "Before hotel operations." She walked inside. He followed, let the door close behind them, and pulled out his personal phone, not the hotel-issued radio, his own phone, the one he paid for himself and which carried a number that was not registered to his current name or address. He found the contact listed as TB and pressed call. It rang twice. Knox. The voice on the other end was alert in the way of someone who didn't sleep deeply. "It's been a while. Tobin. I need something fast and I need it quiet." A short pause. "How fast?" "An hour, maybe less." Another pause, slightly longer. "What am I looking for?" Knox looked at Sienna, who was watching him with the focused attention of someone cataloging details. "Corporate payments. Private contractor, probably operating under a shell or a consulting LLC. Looking for anything that connects to a tech company called Whitmore Technologies, specifically to the Nova Bridge merger that's supposed to close tonight. Whitmore Tech." Tobin's keyboard was already clicking in the background. "That's the Sienna Whitmore outfit. I've read about the merger. She's standing next to me, a beat." "Okay." The keyboard continued. "What happened?" 3 fake security personnel at a signing gala. Organized placement. They had positions before the event started, which means they had inside information on the layout and timing. Knox paused. "Someone wants her removed before the vote." "Removed meaning?" "I don't know yet. I'm not waiting to find out. Right. More clicking. Give me 40 minutes. I'll call this number when I have something. Knox ended the call and looked at Sienna. She was still standing, hadn't sat on the metal stool, which he understood. Sitting would have felt like surrender. He's good? She asked. He's the best I've ever worked with. She nodded slowly. Then, who did you work with? Before. Knox set his phone on the breaker panel beside him and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding exactly how much truth is useful right now and how much is just noise. Navy. SEAL teams, 8 years. Sienna didn't look surprised. Something in her expression suggested she'd already started working toward that answer on her own. And you're running hotel operations now. I am. She looked at him for a moment. Why? It was the question he'd been asked exactly 3 times in 4 years, by people who meant it genuinely, and each time he'd answered it differently, depending on what he thought they could hear. He looked at Sienna Whitmore, standing in a restricted electrical room in a navy dress that cost more than his monthly car payment, and he decided she could hear the real version. My last deployment didn't go the way it was supposed to. He said it simply, without theater. 2 men didn't come home. I made the call that put them where they were. He picked up his phone, turned it over in his hand. I have a daughter. She was 3 when I got back. I decided she was going to have a father who came home every night, even if that father was running hotel operations. He looked up. That's why. Sienna held his gaze. How old is she now? 7, a beat. Her name's Maki. She knows what you did before? She knows I was in the Navy. She knows I traveled a lot. He almost smiled, which was something his face did reluctantly and only partway. She knows I can open jars really fast. That's the part that impresses her most. Sienna laughed briefly, genuinely. The kind of laugh that happens when you're not expecting it, and you're too tired to stop it. Then the laugh faded and the hard edge came back. I'm sorry, she said. About your men, yeah, he looked at the door. So am I. Silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of silence than before, not the tense operational quiet of 2 people managing a crisis, but something more human. The kind of quiet that happens when 2 people have briefly seen each other as actual people and don't quite know what to do with that yet. Knox broke it. Tell me about your CFO. Sienna's expression shifted. Alistair. How long? 9 years, 8 months. She said it with the precision of someone who'd been counting. He came on when the company was 40 people and running on emergency credit. He helped build the financial architecture that made us attractive enough to get to this merger. You trust him. I trusted him, she said. Past tense is doing a lot of work right now. What changed? She turned away slightly, which Knox noted without comment. 3 weeks ago, I asked Alistair for a consolidated view of the merger transaction documents, the ones we'd be presenting to the Nova Bridge board. He sent them. I went through them the next morning, and she stopped. Started again. There was a discrepancy, small. 1 line in a revenue projection that didn't match the source document I'd signed off on 6 weeks earlier. I thought it was a formatting error. I sent it back and asked him to check it. She paused it again. He sent a corrected version 30 minutes later and said it had been a data pull error on the analyst's end. But when I went back to my own files, my copy of the original had been updated too. She turned back to face him. Not the Nova Bridge copy. My copy. The one stored on my private drive that Alistair shouldn't have access to. Knox was very still. He modified your personal files. Someone did. Her jaw was tight, and the only people with admin access to my private drive are myself and the IT director, who ran the background check on the hotel vendors after you got the email. Sienna closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Yes, Knox absorbed this. He didn't say anything aloud about what it meant. The shape of it was already clear enough. If the IT director had been compromised, then the vendor background check was meaningless. And if Alistair had access to her private drive, then the altered documents weren't a mistake. They were preparation. Someone building a case quietly, over weeks, to be used at exactly the right moment. The merger documents, he said. If they're altered and Nova Bridge signs based on the altered version, then the merger is built on fraud, Sienna said. And when it comes apart, and it would come apart, eventually the liability falls on whoever signed, which is me. She met his eyes. Alistair's signature is on the internal review copies, not the final documents. Those have my name at the bottom. So if you disappear tonight, the board appoints emergency leadership. Alistair is the most senior executive after me. She said it without expression, which Knox had learned in the last hour was what she looked like when something was very painful, and she was working hard not to let it be visible. He inherits the merger. He controls the narrative. He decides what gets disclosed and what gets buried. Knox pulled out his phone and looked at the time. 31 minutes had passed since they'd left the ballroom. The signing was in 58 minutes. In the ballroom above them, 3 people were almost certainly no longer standing in their original positions. "They know you're gone," he said. "I know," which means whoever's running the team up there has already reported to whoever hired them, which means Alistair knows. Knox nodded once. Then his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. It was Tobin, calling back 20 minutes ahead of schedule. He answered immediately. "Talk to me." "Okay." Tobin's voice was different, now focused, slightly tighter, the register of a man who has found something he wasn't expecting. "So I pulled the contractor angle first. Ran a search on private security providers with recent operational activity in the downtown hotel district, cross-referenced against any payments routed through shell structures with connections to Whitmore Technologies' financial reporting period. And there's a consulting LLC, Vane Strategic Solutions, registered in Delaware, operating address in a business park outside Baltimore, exactly 1 employee on record. The LLC has received 3 payments in the last 4 months, each routed through a different intermediary. I traced the origin of 2 of them." Tobin stopped for a moment. "Knox, both of them originate from a personal holdings account connected to an Alistair Crane, CFO at Whitmore Technologies." Knox looked at Sienna. She was already watching his face. "You're certain," Knox said. "On 2 of the 3 payments, yes. The 3rd is still routed through 1 more layer, but the pattern is consistent. I'd bet on it." More keyboard sounds. "The principal of Vane Strategic Solutions is a man named Silas Vane. Ex-military private contractor for about 8 years. Disciplinary record. In his last government-adjacent contract, nothing prosecuted, but there were complaints about methods. He runs a team, small, professional, specialized. Specialized how? Asset extraction, mostly. Corporate espionage support. The kind of work that companies use when they want something done without wanting to know how it gets done." Tobin paused. "Knox, if this Vane is running the team at the hotel, these are not amateurs you're dealing with. These are people who do this for a living." "I know." Knox hadn't taken his eyes off Sienna. "One more thing. Is there anything in the communication trail, anything at all about a phone? Specifically about tracking a device?" The sound of rapid typing. "Then yeah, there's an intercepted coordination message. I had to pull this from a secondary source. It's going to take me more time to authenticate it fully, but the content references a primary device and active ping." That's tracking language." Knox looked at Sienna's clutch, which she'd left on the bar in the ballroom with her phones inside it. She'd left the phone. She'd left it because he'd told her to. And now he understood, with a cold and complete certainty, that she'd been right to listen. If her phone was transmitting location data, then every step they'd taken in the last 50 minutes had been clean. Silas Vane's team had been following a signal that had been sitting still on the bar since 8:05. But that would change the moment someone picked up that clutch. "Tobin," Knox said, "I need you to stay on the line for the next hour." "Can you do that?" "I'm not going anywhere." Knox lowered the phone and looked at Sienna. He said it plainly, the way he'd learned to say things that needed to land without decoration. "Your CFO hired a private contractor named Silas Vane to remove you from the hotel tonight before the signing. The payments are documented. There's also a tracking device or an active signal of some kind associated with your phone. You left it on the bar, which means they still think you're in the ballroom." Sienna stood very still for a long moment, not frozen still. The way you go still when something you suspected but didn't want to be true turns out to be true, and the confirmation lands somewhere specific in your chest. 9 years, she said quietly. Not to him, to something in herself. "I know. I brought him in when we had nothing. I fought the board to keep his salary competitive when we were still losing money." She stopped. Her voice hadn't broken, but it had gone thinner, the way a voice does when it's working against something. "He was at my mother's funeral." Knox said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that, and he'd been around enough grief to know that meaningless comfort was worse than silence. Sienna straightened. Something moved across her face, not hardness exactly, more like resolution. The kind that forms when someone is finished being surprised and started being angry, and the anger is the kind that doesn't yell. "What do we do?" It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of the next sentence. We stay in the building service network," Knox said. "We keep moving. The sublevels connect to the parking structure, and from there to the service alley on the north side. As long as they think you're in the ballroom, we have time. When that changes," he paused. "It changes fast. Vane's team will redeploy the moment they know the phone's been abandoned. How long do we have before someone moves the clutch? Someone at a bar in a ballroom finds an unclaimed clutch. He looked at her. Less than 20 minutes. She nodded. Then we move now. They left the electrical room and went back into the corridor, moving north through the sublevel. Knox set the pace not running, which created noise and burned energy and attracted attention, but the fast, deliberate walk of someone who knows where they are going. Sienna matched him step for step. She'd taken her heels off somewhere in the electrical room without making any comment about it, and was moving now in bare feet on the concrete floor, the navy dress hitched slightly at the knee. Knox noticed, and didn't say anything, because it wasn't the kind of thing that needed saying. "Tell me about the people you trust," he said as they moved. "Not the people you work with. The ones you actually trust." Sienna thought. "My assistant, Della. She's been with me 6 years. I'd bet my life on her." "Who else?" "There's a lawyer, external counsel, not company staff. Nadia Reeves. She knows the merger documentation better than anyone, and she's never had access to the internal systems, which means whatever Alistair has been doing wouldn't touch her. Can you reach her tonight?" "If I had a phone, yes." Knox was already pulling out his personal phone. He held it out to her without slowing down. "Use mine. Don't call anyone connected to the company systems. Your lawyer and your assistant only. Tell them you're safe. Tell them the signing needs to be delayed without giving a public reason. And tell them to not speak to Alistair or Marcus about your location." Sienna took the phone. She dialed from memory a number she knew without looking it up, and Knox listened with half his attention while he navigated the junction ahead. "Nadia," Sienna's voice was level and quiet. "It's me. Don't say my name out loud. Don't yes. I'm safe. Listen to me carefully. The signing cannot proceed tonight. I need you to contact the Nova Bridge team lead directly and tell them we need a 24-hour postponement due to a document verification issue. Don't go through anyone at Whitmore for this. Do it yourself." A pause. "No, I can't explain right now. I need you to trust me." Another pause shorter. I know it's bad timing. Do it anyway." She listened for a moment. "Thank you. Stay available. I'll reach you when I can." She ended the call and dialed a second number, Della. "It's me. I need you to do something important, and I need you to do it without talking to anyone in the building first." She spoke quickly and quietly, and Knox heard the assistant's voice rising on the other end, worried, questions tumbling over each other, and he heard Sienna cut through it with calm precision. "Stop. Listen. I'm okay. I need you to pull the merger document archive, the original signed copies from the secure server, not the working versions, and I need you to send them to Nadia Reeves's personal email. Encrypted. Can you do that right now?" A pause. "Yes, right now. Do it before you call anyone else. Then call me back on this number." She handed the phone back to Knox. He took it without looking, keeping his eyes on the corridor junction ahead. "Good. I've been running a company for 8 years, she said. "I know how to make calls. I didn't say you didn't." They reached a steel door at the end of the north corridor. Knox stopped and listened. The door led to the base of the parking structure stairwell, not the guest parking, the service level, which connected to the structure's lower decks through a maintenance passage. He'd used this route twice before, once for a plumbing emergency, and once during a fire drill when he'd needed to verify the secondary egress paths were clear. He pushed the door open slowly. The parking structure was colder than the hotel, the kind of damp cold that parking garages carry in all seasons, smelling like exhaust and concrete. The lights were the standard overhead fluorescents, buzzing faintly, throwing everything in the same flat yellowish white. Empty, at least in their immediate sightline. "Stay close," he said. They moved into the structure and took the maintenance passage that ran along the west wall. Knox kept them away from the open lanes where vehicle headlights would have caught movement. The passage narrower and darker, but it connected to a service exit that opened onto the north alley, the building's loading and utility side, invisible from the hotel's main entrance and from the front street. They were halfway through when Knox's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "Tobin," he answered quickly. "What? Movement," Tobin said. His voice had changed again, less analytical, more direct. "I've been watching the Vane operations communication pattern, and there was a burst of traffic approximately 4 minutes ago. Short, encrypted, but the timing matches a redeployment signal." He paused. "Knox." Someone found the phone. Knox was already moving faster, one hand on Sienna's arm to signal the change in pace. "Where's the ping showing?" "Last location was the ballroom bar. Now it's moving, someone picked it up. But that's not the problem. More typing." The problem is the traffic I'm seeing suggests the team has split. Part of them are still at the hotel. But I'm seeing communication signatures consistent with a vehicle-based unit moving to a secondary position. They're boxing the exterior, Knox said. That's what it looks like. Knox, they know she left the building. Or they suspect it. They're covering the outside. Knox looked at Sienna. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what was changing. Her face was still. We can't go out the north exit, he said. No. Tobin again. And Knox, one more thing. I finished running the third payment I couldn't authenticate earlier, and it's clean now. Same origin as the others. But here's what I didn't expect. A pause. There's a fourth payment. Much smaller. More recent, sent 3 days ago. Another pause. It went to a vendor account connected to Marcus Hale. Your Tobin stopped. Is that her head of security? Knox looked at Sienna. Her face did something complicated. He watched it happen, the sequence of it, the way something that might have been the last thin possibility of doubt closed and locked. Marcus, who had run the background checks, who was stationed upstairs outside the signing room, who knew every position of every member of her security team. Yes, Knox said into the phone. That's her head of security. Sienna put one hand flat against the parking structure wall. Not for balance, for something to press against. He knew, she said. It came out quietly. He knew the whole time he was telling me the checks came back clean. Knox gave her 5 seconds. It wasn't mercy, it was practicality. She needed 5 seconds to absorb it, and he needed 5 seconds to figure out the next move, and those two needs happened to coincide. Tobin, he said, I need you to package everything you've found payments, contractor identity, communication signatures, all of it, and send it to a contact I'm going to give you. Encrypted. He thought for a moment. And I need you to find me a route. We're in the parking structure sublevel. The exterior exits are being watched. I need to know if there's a connecting passage to anything adjacent utility tunnel, neighboring building, anything. Rapid typing. Give me 2 minutes. Knox kept moving, slower now, keeping them in the shadows along the maintenance passage wall. Sienna walked beside him with her hand no longer on the wall. She'd straightened back up. He'd watched her do it, the deliberate physical act of pulling herself upright, which he recognized as a person deciding to function rather than feel, at least for now. Marcus took money, she said. Not accusatory, just saying it, checking that it was real. Yes, and Alistair paid for all of it. The evidence says yes. She was quiet for a moment. 9 years ago, I took Alistair to dinner to celebrate our first profitable quarter. We split the check because that's what we did back then. We didn't have expense accounts yet. She paused. He ordered the fish. I remember that. Knox looked at her sideways. Why do you remember that? Because I remember everything. It's the thing people like about me and hate about me at the same time. She looked ahead. Alistair knew that about me too, which means he's been very, very careful. Careful enough to think he could get away with this. Until tonight, Tobin's voice came back on the phone.
Okay.
There's a utility tunnel connection to the building next door, a commercial office structure, currently unoccupied after hours. The tunnel runs under the property line. Access point is behind the secondary water main cabinet, level B2. You're in B3 right now. Go up 1 level. Look for a gray metal cabinet marked Main 2 on the west wall. Can we get into the neighboring building? The tunnel access is on a shared maintenance code. I found it in the property management records. Code is 4471. And on the other side? Lobby level emergency exit onto the side street. No cameras on that exit building's been half a cont for 2 years, and the security system is minimal. Knox was already heading for the stairwell to B2. Send that evidence package the moment it's compiled. I'll give you an address. He gave Tobin the contact Nadia Reeves, Sienna's external counsel, and confirmed she'd receive it within the hour. Then he pocketed the phone and looked at Sienna. There's a tunnel, he said. It takes us out of this building and into the one next door. From there, a street exit. And then we figure out what to do with everything Tobin just found. She almost said something. He could see her almost say it, some version of thank you, or why are you doing this, or one of the other things that people say when they're startled by unexpected help and don't know what to do with the feeling. But she didn't say any of it, and he was glad, because he wouldn't have known what to do with it either. Level B2, she said, west wall mate 2. Yeah. They went up the stairwell together, the sound of their footsteps absorbed by the concrete, and Knox kept his hand near his radio, even though he no longer had the hotel radio on him, the old habit, the body's muscle memory, reaching for something that wasn't there anymore, the way it always did when the stakes got high enough. He was a hotel operations manager. He was a single father, He was a man who had spent 4 years constructing a life specifically designed to stay small and quiet and survivable. None of that had changed. And yet, here he was, moving through a parking structure sublevel in the middle of the night, with a woman who'd trusted him with 2 words, a phone in his pocket carrying evidence of a conspiracy that could dismantle a 9-figure merger, and a team of professional operatives redeploying on the other side of the walls around them. He thought briefly of Mackie, her room. The drawing she'd taped to the refrigerator last week, a house with the big yellow sun and 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, which she'd labeled DAD and ME in her careful, crooked 7-year-old handwriting. He pushed it back. Not a way back. He would think about it later, when later existed. Right now there was a cabinet marked MAT2 on a west wall somewhere above him, and a tunnel on the other side of it, and a woman walking beside him who had trusted him with the biggest night of her life, based on nothing more than 2 words and the look on his face when he'd scanned the ballroom. He wasn't going to let that be the wrong call. The tunnel was exactly where Tobin said it would be, a low concrete passage, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, running beneath the property line with pipes and conduit bundles lining both walls, and a string of dim safety slits mounted every 15 feet along the ceiling. The air was damp and carried the faint metallic smell of old water. Knox had to duck slightly at the entrance. Sienna didn't. They moved through it quickly and without talking, their footsteps flat and absorbed by the concrete, and Knox counted the lights as they passed them, the way he'd learned to count things in confined spaces, not from anxiety but from the habit of keeping track of distance when you couldn't see what was ahead. 7 lights to the other side, roughly 80 feet. The door at the far end was steel, slightly rusted at the hinges, and it opened with the specific resistance of something that had not been used recently but still worked. The neighboring building's basement level was dark except for the emergency lighting strips along the floor, green, white, and low, casting everything in a color that made the concrete look like the bottom of something. Knox let the tunnel door close behind them and stood still for a moment, listening. The building was empty. He could tell from the quality of the silence no HVAC hum, no distant elevator mechanics, no ambient current of a structure with people in it. Just the settling sounds of an old commercial building holding its own weight in the dark. Lobby level, he said quietly. 1 flight up. The stairwell was at the far end of the basement, and they took it without incident, coming out into a lobby that had clearly once been a respectable corporate address and was now somewhere between occupied and abandoned, a reception desk still in place, chairs still arranged, but the surfaces dusty and the signage of the previous tenant still partially visible through the peeling overlay of whatever company had moved in, and presumably moved back out. The emergency exit was on the south wall, a push-bar door with a small red sign above it. Knox put his hand on it and paused. This opens onto the side street. It'll be quieter than the front, but they may have repositioned someone on this block. He looked at Sienna. Walk normal. Don't look for them. If you see someone you think is Vane's, don't react. Let me handle it. How will I know if you've seen one? I'll slow down. She nodded. He pushed the door open. The side street was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of block that existed between addresses rather than at them, service entrances, dumpster alcoves, a loading dock for a restaurant supply company that was dark and locked at this hour. The night air hit them immediately, cooler than the tunnel and carrying the low background noise of a city that never fully stopped. 2 blocks east, the main street traffic was visible as headlights moving across the intersection. In the other direction, the street curved and emptied. Knox scanned it in the systematic way that had never stopped being automatic, not a dramatic sweep, just a reading. Parked cars, 3 sedans and a delivery van, all dark, all still. A man walking a dog at the far end of the block, moving away from them, unhurried. A second-floor window with a light on in the restaurant supply building, probably a security guard's office. Nothing that looked like Vane's. They moved out and turned east, away from the hotel, walking at the pace of 2 people who had somewhere to be but not somewhere urgent. Knox kept himself on the outside of the sidewalk between Sienna and the street. Old habit. She noticed he could tell from the slight adjustment she made to her own position, accepting the geometry without making anything of it. His phone buzzed. Tobin. Tell me, Knox said. The vehicle unit I was tracking earlier has repositioned. Based on cell tower pings, and I want to be clear this is educated inference, not hard data, they've moved to the north perimeter of the hotel block. The team inside is still operating, but there's been a change in communication frequency. That usually means command is reassessing. They know the building's clean. That's my read. Knox, I also got a partial on an outgoing call from one of the numbers I've been tracking. It connected to a landline. I haven't traced the landline yet, but the call was short. 30 seconds. Reporting in, Knox said. Someone's keeping someone informed in real time. That would be my red too. Keep working the landline. He ended the call and looked at Sienna, who was watching him with the focused patience of someone who was very good at listening to half a conversation and assembling the missing pieces. They've repositioned to the north side. We need to stay off the hotel block completely. Where are we going? He'd been thinking about that since they'd left the electrical room. The honest answer was that he'd been running reactive one step at a time, managing each immediate threat as it presented itself, which was the right call when you didn't have enough information to plan beyond the next 10 minutes. But they were out of the building now. The evidence was assembled and in the hands of Nadia Reeves, and the question was shifting from how do we survive the next hour to what do we do with what we know. I need to think about that, he said, which was honest. She accepted it. Well, you think I need to tell you something about Silas Vane, the name you got from Tobin. Knox looked at her sideways. I've heard that name before, she said. Not in the context of security contracting. In the context of a competitor acquisition that happened 2 years ago. A company called Drayfield Systems, they were acquired by a PE firm in a deal that fell through twice before the third attempt succeeded. There were rumors afterward that Drayfield's CEO had been pressured to accept terms she found unfavorable. Sienna paused. The rumors said someone had been watching her, managing her, making sure she was in the right place at the right time with the right vulnerabilities exposed. Knox was quiet for a moment. You think Vane was involved in that? I think Alistair was involved in advising the PE firm that acquired Drayfield. I didn't connect those two facts until about 30 seconds ago. Because you just heard Vane's name tonight. Yes. She exhaled slowly. This may not be the first time Alistair has done something like this. Knox absorbed that. A man who had done this before, who had refined the method, learned from whatever had worked and whatever hadn't, built a relationship with the contractor he trusted, was a different problem than a man making a desperate first attempt. Experienced people made fewer improvised mistakes. They planned for contingencies. They had exits. Alistair Crane had spent 9 years inside Whitmore Technologies building those exits, one financial record at a time. He's going to move fast, Knox said. Once Vane reports that the extraction failed, Alistair shifts to his backup. The board, Sienna said. He'll go to the board with whatever story he's prepared. Tell them I disappeared, that I'm unstable, that the merger documents show irregularities that suggest I've been. She stopped. He's been building that narrative for weeks. The altered documents. The questions about my judgment he's been planting quietly with 2 of the directors. I heard about it secondhand and thought it was just politics. It wasn't politics, it was groundwork, no. Her voice had gone very flat. It wasn't. They turned south at the intersection, moving deeper into the commercial district, and Knox was running the problem the way he'd learned to run problems not linearly, but in parallel tracks, multiple variables at once, looking for the arrangement that produced the least bad outcome, rather than waiting for a good one to appear. The evidence was with Nadia. That was the foundation. Vane's team was positioned on the hotel's north side, which meant they had a gap to the south and east. That was the operational reality. Alistair didn't know yet that the financial trail had been traced. He knew the extraction had failed. He didn't know that Knox had a name, a payment history, and a direct connection to him. That was the advantage, temporary, but real. The question was whether they could use it before Alistair moved to his next play. Knox's phone buzzed again. He expected Tobin. The number was one he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice, calculating, then answered, yeah. A pause on the other end. Then a voicemail, measured, with the specific careful diction of someone who had learned to control what they communicated through tone. You've been more resourceful than I anticipated. I'll acknowledge that. Knox said nothing. This doesn't need to escalate further, the voice continued. You're a hotel employee, Mr. Bellamy, a very capable one, based on what I've been reading in the last hour. But you have a daughter. You have a life you've built that has nothing to do with Whitmore Technologies or Nova Bridge or any of this. A beat. Walk away. Take the woman somewhere public and call the police. Let the legal process handle whatever it handles. You'll be fine. She'll be fine. Everyone goes home. Knox had listened to the whole thing without moving his expression. Sienna was watching him, close enough to hear the voice on the phone, but not the words. He tilted the phone slightly so she could hear the next part. I'm going to decline, Knox said. A silence. Then that's a mistake.
Maybe.
Knox kept his voice completely level. But you just called me from an operational number because you wanted me to back off, which means you're concerned enough about what I know to make the call. That means whatever I have is worth more than you want me to think. He paused, one beat, and you looked up my military record. A longer silence this time. So you know how this works, Knox said. Running doesn't fix it. Making deals over the phone doesn't fix it. The only thing that fixes it is finishing it. He ended the call. Sienna stared at him for a moment. That was vain. Yes, he knows your name. He does. She processed that. Is that bad? Knox considered the question with the honesty it deserved. It means he'll escalate. He called because negotiating was the cheap option. When I declined, he moved to the expensive one. He looked up the street, east toward the lights of the main commercial block. He'll pull his best people off the hotel perimeter and redirect them. To find us. Yes. Sienna was quiet for exactly the length of time it took them to cross the street. Then you could still walk away. He offered it. He offered it because he thought it would work. But you have a daughter. She said it without accusation, just putting it in the room, the way honest people put difficult things. You could get clear of this right now. Knox stopped walking. Not from emotion, from the need to actually look at her when he said this, so she understood he wasn't performing it. If I walk away, you're alone with a team of professionals and a CFO who has a plan B that doesn't require Vane at all. You call the police, maybe. They arrive in 8 minutes, maybe. In 8 minutes, a lot of things happen. He met her eyes. Maki needs a father who comes home. She also needs to have a father who doesn't leave people in situations like this. He started walking again. Those two things aren't in conflict. They're the same thing. Sienna didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was quiet. Okay. One word. But it carried weight. Knox was already thinking about the warehouse. He'd noticed it 6 months ago, one of those details his brain had filed and kept without being asked to. A decommissioned light industrial complex, 3 blocks east of the hotel district. 2 buildings connected by a covered loading bay. Chain link perimeter, with sections that had been cut and reattached with wire that looked intact from a distance but wasn't. The buildings had been slated for development twice. Both times the permits had stalled, and the result was a property that was large, enclosed, and structurally complex, full of rooms and corridors and vertical levels that an outsider would have to map from scratch. Knox knew it because the building's maintenance contract had briefly overlapped with the hotel's service vendor network 18 months ago, and he'd walked the structure as part of a facilities assessment that never went anywhere. He'd spent 4 hours in those buildings with a clipboard and a floor plan, and his brain had kept every hallway. He turned east. Where are we going? Sienna asked. Somewhere I know better than they do. She heard the shift in his voice, the thing that happened when he stopped being a hotel operations manager, running an improvised defensive situation, and started being something older and more specific. She didn't ask again. It took them 11 minutes to reach the warehouse complex. Knox located the compromised section of chain link by memory and peeled it back carefully, holding it for Sienna, then resetting it behind them. The exterior was dark. The interior would be darker. He pulled out his phone and used the flashlight at its lowest setting, enough to navigate, not enough to be visible through a window from outside. Stay behind me, he said. Step where I step. If I stop, you stop. Understood. He took her through the outer building's loading entrance, a roll-up door that had been padlocked with a chain that had no lock on it, just wound to look like one, and into the main floor. It was large and open, the roof high enough to disappear into darkness above them. The floor concrete with old machinery footprints still visible where equipment had been bolted and removed. Knox moved them toward the interior of the connected building, which was smaller, its layout a series of offices and processing rooms that created natural choke points. He found the room he wanted on the second level, a former supervisor's office with reinforced walls, the old kind, concrete block, rather than drywall, 1 door in, 1 window looking down onto the main floor, and a second door that connected to an adjacent storeroom and from there to a back stairwell. 2 exits, defensible entry, sightlines he could use. In here, he said. Sienna stepped inside and looked around. This is your plan. Part of it. He set his phone face down on the floor so the light didn't bleed under the door. I need you to stay in this room. There's another door behind those shelves that leads to a back stairwell that goes down to the east exit. If you hear shooting, there won't be shooting, she said. It came out slightly too fast. If you hear anything that tells you this room is being breached, he said, continuing without acknowledging the interruption, you go through that door, down the stairs, out the east exit. Turn left, walk 2 blocks to the main street, and call 911. You tell them your name and your location, and you stay on the line. He met her eyes. Can you remember that? Left 2 blocks, 911. She said it back without hesitation.
Yes.
Good. He turned toward the door, knocks. Her voice stopped him. How many of them are there? He thought about being imprecise. He decided against it. Tobin tracked at least 5 on the hotel operation. Vane runs small teams efficiency over numbers, so probably 5 to 7 including Vane himself. Sienna sat down on one of the old office chairs, which creaked loudly and made her wince. And you're one person. I know this building, he said. They don't. He paused. That matters more than the numbers. He pulled the door mostly closed and moved to the window overlooking the main floor, staying back from the glass, using the darkness inside the room as cover. Then he called Tobin. I need you to do something for me, he said quietly. And I need you to do it before they get here, because once they're here, I won't be available to have this conversation. Already pulling up the interface, Tobin said. There was something in his voice, an old steadiness, the frequency 2 people find when they've worked in genuinely bad situations together and trust the other person's competence without needing to perform confidence at each other. Talk to me. Everything you have, the payment trail, the Vane connection, the communication intercepts, the tracking device reference, all of it, I need it packaged and ready for law enforcement. Not just the lawyer, actual investigators. The kind that can act tonight. There's a financial crimes task force contact I've used before. Clean, the sound of Tobin moving, pulling something up. Do you trust the local field office? Yes. Package it for them. Include everything with enough annotation that they can understand it without the full background. A pause. Can you do a time-delayed send? Set it to go in 40 minutes unless I cancel it? Yeah, easy. More typing. Knox, what are you planning to do in 40 minutes? Knox looked down at the dark main floor of the warehouse, the shapes of old machinery, and the geometry of the space he'd mapped 18 months ago with a clipboard he no longer had but didn't need. Finish it, he said. One way or another. I don't love that answer. I know. He ended the call. He stood at the window and breathed and let himself think not about tactics, not about Vane's approach routes or his own positioning, but just for 30 seconds about Maki, about the drawing on the refrigerator, about the way she smelled in the mornings, like sleep, and the specific brand of shampoo he'd been buying for her since she was 4. About the sound of her voice when she was telling him about her day at school, the way she always started in the middle of the story and worked outward in both directions simultaneously, because that was how her brain organized things, and he'd stopped trying to redirect her to the beginning, because the middle was usually the best part anyway. He thought about the men who hadn't come home from his last deployment. He thought about the weight of that, which had not gotten lighter over 4 years, it had just become more familiar. The way a scar becomes part of the body without becoming less real. He thought about a woman sitting in a creaking chair in a dark office behind him, who had trusted him with 2 words and had not once, in the entire course of the night, behaved like someone who expected to be saved. She'd behaved like someone fighting alongside him with the tools she had. He was not going to let any of it be for nothing. 15 minutes later, he heard them enter the outer building. Vane's people were good. He could tell from the way they moved, minimal light use, disciplined spacing, no unnecessary communication. Someone who didn't know what they were listening for wouldn't have heard them at all. Knox heard them because he knew exactly which parts of the outer building's floor had shifted in ways that created sound when weight moved over them, and he'd been waiting for precisely those sounds. 4 entry points covered in the outer building, which meant at least 4 personnel, possibly a 5th, holding the exterior. Vane himself would be either at the perimeter or moving with the primary entry team. Knox moved away from the window and started down the interior staircase, not toward them, sideways, positioning himself in the connected section between the 2 buildings. The loading bay corridor. It was the narrowest part of the structure, and narrow was his advantage. In an open field, 5 trained operatives against 1 was a problem without a good solution. In a building full of corners, confined passages, and darkness, it was a different equation. He found the first man in the loading bay corridor. The operative was moving with a small tactical light clipped to his vest, which was the right tool for the job, and also so, in a building full of visual angles Knox already knew, the thing that made him visible from 40 feet before he could see Knox at all. Knox watched him approach, calculated the timing, then moved not from the shadows dramatically, but practically, from a position behind a partial wall that the operative's light hadn't swept yet because the angle made it look like solid structure from that approach. It was quick and it was quiet, and it didn't involve shooting anyone. The operative was unconscious before he'd had time to register what was happening, and Knox had his tactical light and his radio in the next 10 seconds. He listened to the radio. There were 2 active voices coordinating a sweep pattern, calling positions. One to his north, one somewhere above him. The one above him would be the problem. The upstairs approach would bring someone toward the office where Sienna was waiting, and Knox could not let that happen without getting ahead of it. He moved back through the loading bay and took the east stairwell, the one that connected to the back of the second level. He was moving quickly now, not running but close, keeping his footsteps distributed to minimize sound and using the ambient darkness as cover. He came up through the stairwell door on the second level and immediately pressed himself against the wall. The corridor was 40 feet long. At the far end, a figure was moving toward the supervisor's office door. Knox didn't wait for better conditions. He moved. The operative heard him at the last second turned, started to raise a hand, and Knox was already past the point of the movement that mattered. It was over in under 4 seconds. The man went down hard against the corridor wall, and Knox caught him before he could make the kind of noise that falls loudly, lowering him to the floor with the focused care of someone who was not trying to kill anyone and had a lot of practice at the distinction. He checked the radio again. 2 voices still active on the ground floor. 1 unaccounted for. Vane. Knox moved back to the east stairwell and descended, thinking about the geometry of the ground floor and where the 2 remaining voice sources had been positioning. The outer building. They were sweeping the outer building because they hadn't found anything on the first pass and were working back toward the perimeter. Vane would be outside or at the primary entry point watching the exits, letting his team flush whatever was inside, which meant Vane was at the loading dock entrance. Knox moved through the inner building and stopped at the loading bay threshold, pressing himself against the doorframe. The loading dock doors were partially open the way they'd been when he and Sienna had entered, and through the gap he could see the exterior loading area and the ambient light from the street beyond the fence line. Silas Vane was standing 10 feet from the loading dock door, his back 3/4 to Knox, watching the outer perimeter. He was holding a radio in one hand and was exactly the kind of professional that Knox had anticipated from Tobin's descriptions, still, patient, positioned to see without being seen from the street. He hadn't anticipated someone coming at him from inside the building because his people were supposed to have cleared inside. Knox stepped through the loading bay door. Vane heard him. He was fast-turned immediately, his radio hand dropping, his body weight shifting into a combat posture that told Knox everything necessary about the man's training. He was good. He was also in this moment facing the wrong direction to reach his sidearm before Knox was on him. The exchange was brief and brutal, and not elegant in the slightest nothing real ever was. Knox took a hit to his left ribs that was going to hurt considerably more once the adrenaline receded, and Vane took the kind of disarmament that left his weapon on the ground, and his hands secured behind him with his own zip ties, which Knox found in the man's vest pocket. Practical. Vane had come prepared for restraining someone else, which had a certain irony that Knox focused us to appreciate at the moment. He pressed Vane face down onto the loading dock floor and kept one knee on the man's back while he caught his breath. His ribs screamed at him. He told them to wait. "You have 2 men down inside," Knox said, "and 2 more in the outer building who are going to find each other and figure out what's happening in the next few minutes. If you want this to stay non-fatal for everyone involved, tell them to stand down." Vane was breathing hard. There was a pause that was long enough for Knox to understand that the man was genuinely calculating not whether to comply, but whether there was an angle he hadn't used yet. Professionals always looked for the angle. "You can't keep all of us contained," Vane said. His voice was strained but controlled. "I don't need to." Knox held out the radio he'd taken from the first operative. "I need to keep you contained long enough for the evidence package to transmit to the Financial Crimes Task Force at the field office. That happens in..." He checked the time, 14 minutes. "After that, whether you walk out of this building or get carried out doesn't change what lands in their inbox." A silence that was different from the previous one. Longer. More calculating in a way that suggested the calculation was moving toward a different conclusion. "You had that ready before you brought us here," Vane said. "Yes." Another pause. Then, with the flat acknowledgement of a professional who knows when an operation is over, "You were SEAL teams." "Past tense," Knox said. Past tense, Vane agreed. Something in his voice that might have been a kind of grim recognition one soldier extends to another, regardless of which side of an operation they ended up on. Then, what do you want? Tell your team to stand down and stay inside the outer building. Don't call anyone outside this operation. In 14 minutes, this is over regardless. Knox kept his voice level. Or don't, and we do this the way it's already going, which works for me and doesn't work for you. Another silence. Then Vane reached one hand toward the radio Knox let him and keyed it. He spoke 2 sentences in the clear, calm voice of a commander telling his people to hold position. The 2 voices on the ground floor acknowledged in sequence. Knox took the radio back. He stayed where he was, knee on Vane's back, ribs complaining steadily, watching the clock on his phone count toward the 14-minute mark. At 11 minutes, Tobin called. Package is queued. I'm getting confirmation back from my contact at the task force. They have a duty agent tonight. They're going to open it as soon as it lands. Good, Knox exhaled slowly. And the landline? The call Vane made earlier? Traced it. Tobin's voice was careful. Knox, it went to an Alderton Grand hotel room. Reserved under a corporate account connected to Whitmore Technologies' quarterly accommodation budget. A beat. Alistair Crane checked in at 4 this afternoon. He's been in the hotel the whole time. Knox absorbed that. He looked at the dark sky above the loading dock, the orange glow of the city pushing up into the clouds, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger, but sat in the space between them, the feeling of a picture coming completely into focus for the first time. Send that to Nadia Reeves and the task force both, he said. Exactly as you found it. Already done, a pause. Knox, you okay? Knox considered his ribs. Define okay. Are you upright and ambulatory? Yes, then you're okay. Tobin paused again. Tell me when you're clear. At exactly the 14-minute mark, Knox's phone showed an automated confirmation from Tobin's system. Package transmitted and received. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pulled out the phone and called Sienna. She picked up on the first ring. It's done, he said. Stay in the office. I'll come up. He walked back through the loading bay, through the inner building, up the east stairwell to the second level. The corridor was empty except for the operatives still on the floor where Knox had left him, beginning to stir. Knox checked the zip ties, found them adequate, and continued to the supervisor's office. He knocked twice their agreed signal and pushed the door open. Sienna was standing in the middle of the room, not sitting in the chair. She had one hand curled at her side and the other pressed flat against her sternum, the way people press when they're trying to physically hold something steady inside themselves. When she saw Knox, the hand at her sternum dropped. She looked at him, at the way he was standing, slightly favoring his left side. At his face, which he knew communicated nothing he didn't intend it to. You're hurt, she said. Ribs. Is everyone. Nobody's dead. He leaned against the doorframe, veins contained. His team is standing down. The evidence package went to the task force 14 minutes ago. He held her gaze. Alistair is in a hotel room at the Alderton Grand. He's been there since 4 o'clock. He checked in to wait for confirmation that it worked. Sienna was very still. He was in the building the whole night. Yes. Something moved across her face that Knox didn't try to name. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then it resolved into something quieter and harder. What happens now? Investigators receive the package. They'll have enough to move on Alistair before morning. Knox straightened from the doorframe and controlled the wince that his ribs sent through him. But Alistair doesn't know any of that yet, which means he's going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning believing he won. Sienna looked at him. And you're going to walk in after him, Knox said, with everything we have. Outside the warehouse, somewhere in the distance, a siren started. Then another. Knox stood in the doorway of an empty office in an abandoned building in the middle of the night, his ribs broken or close to it, a woman with no shoes looking at him from across the room, and the quiet after a long, grinding thing that had finally stopped felt very loud. He would call it in now. Law enforcement. Ambulatory and on the scene with a contained suspect and 2 others secured. He'd done this before, not in hotel buildings with corporate conspiracies, but in the fundamental shape of it, the long bad night that ends when it ends and not a minute before. He pulled out the phone, and somewhere above them, in a hotel room that smelled like fresh linen and ambition, Alistair Crane was staring at a ceiling, waiting for his phone to ring with news that was never coming. The police arrived at the warehouse complex at 12 minutes past midnight. Knox had called it in himself calm, specific, no dramatics, and then stood at the loading dock entrance with his hands visible and his hotel ID clipped to his shirt, So the first officers through the perimeter gate had something immediate to look at that wasn't a threat. He'd learned that from his first week back in civilian life, when law enforcement arrives at a scene, the most useful thing you can do is make yourself immediately legible. Name, affiliation, role, let the situation explain itself. It took 40 minutes for the scene to stabilize. Vane and 2 of his operatives were taken into custody. The other 2, who had been holding position in the outer building per Vane's stand-down order, came out without incident when officers moved through the structure hands up, weapons on the ground, the specific cooperative compliance of professionals who understood that the operation was finished and that resistance at this point served no purpose. They were contractors, not ideologues. When the math stopped working, they stopped. A detective named Okafor took Knox's statement in the back of a patrol vehicle, writing in a small notebook with the focused shorthand of someone who had done this enough times that the process was almost muscle memory. He asked clean questions and didn't ask the same one twice, which Knox appreciated. Sienna gave her statement separately to a second detective sitting in the loading dock doorway with Knox's jacket over her shoulders because the night had gotten colder and someone had thought to offer it. Knox watched her from across the lot while Okafor finished his notes. She was talking steadily, gesturing occasionally, and her feet were still bare on the concrete. She'd never found her heels after leaving the electrical room, and there was something about the combination of the navy dress and the bare feet and the complete lack of apology in her posture that made her look, Knox thought, like someone who had survived something significant and was already thinking about what came next. At 1:30, Okafor closed his notebook. The Financial Crimes Unit has already opened the package your associate sent. They have a duty agent on it tonight. He looked at Knox with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he understood. You put this together in what, 4 hours? About that. The SEAL background. Past tense, Knox said. For the second time that night. Okafor nodded slowly. There's going to be a full interview process. Formal statements follow up. Could take a few days. I know. You're not going anywhere? Knox almost said something dry about not having anywhere in particular to go. Then he thought about Makey, asleep in her room at his sister's house 3 miles away. He'd called his sister from the warehouse while waiting for the police, kept it short, told her everything was fine, would explain in the morning, and felt the specific weight of someone who had somewhere very definite to be. I live here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Okafor gave him a card. Knox gave him Tobin's contact information, which he knew Tobin had already prepared for and would manage without difficulty. Then he walked back across the loading dock to where Sienna was finishing her statement. She looked up when he approached. The second detective was rapping, gathering her own notes. We may need to reach you tomorrow, the detective said. My external counsel, Nadia Reeves, will be the contact point. Sienna said it with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing institutional relationships for years. She has everything you'll need, and she's been briefed. She gave a number and a name, and the detective thanked her and moved away. Sienna and Knox stood in the loading dock for a moment, in the way people stand when a long, sustained thing has ended and the body hasn't entirely processed that it's over. They're going to go to the hotel, Knox said. Tonight. Alistair's room. I know. It would be better if he didn't get a warning call first. I haven't called him, Sienna said. I won't, a pause. I don't actually want to talk to him. I don't know what I would say. She looked out at the lot, where patrol vehicles had arranged themselves in the way they always did, slightly chaotic, purposefully present. I've been thinking about what to say to him for the last hour, and I keep landing on the same thing. What's that? She was quiet for a moment. Nothing. I've got nothing. She looked at Knox. Everything I thought about him was wrong. I don't know who I was talking to for 9 years. That's not something you can put into a sentence. Knox understood that. Not from the specific experience of a betrayal like this one, but from the general experience of finding out that a situation you thought you understood was something entirely different, the particular silence that follows a revelation that retroactively rewrites a long stretch of time. He'd felt it after the deployment. The mission they thought they understood. The intelligence that had been wrong. He didn't say any of that because it wasn't the moment for it. He just stood there while she looked at the lot and processed something that was going to take considerably longer than one night. Then she exhaled. I need to get to my lawyer, and I need shoes. The second problem was solved 20 minutes later by an officer who found a pair of slip-on sneakers in the back of a patrol vehicle, someone's gym shoes, a full size too large, and offered them without ceremony. Sienna put them on, looked down at them, looked up at Knox, and something crossed her face that was somewhere between absurdity and gratitude. She didn't comment. She just tied the laces. The first problem, Nadia Reeves was already awake. Knox learned this when Sienna borrowed his phone again and called, and Nadia answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who had been sitting up waiting. The conversation was brisk and organized on both ends. Nadia had the merger documents. She had the evidence package from Tobin. She had 3 contacts at the company's primary law firm who were already aware that something had happened and were standing by. "Where are you?" Nadia asked. Sienna looked at Knox, who gave her the cross streets. "I'll have a car there in 12 minutes, Nadia said. "Don't talk to any journalists. Don't call the board. Don't call anyone at the company until we've had 30 minutes together." "I wasn't planning to. I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway, because it's 2 in the morning and you've been through something. And sometimes people do impulsive things when they've been through something." A pause. "Are you all right?" Sienna seemed to consider the question with genuine attention, rather than defaulting to the reflexive "I'm fine" that Knox had heard her use exactly 0 times in the past several hours. "No," she said, "but I'm functional. That'll have to be enough for tonight." Nadia's voice softened by a fraction. 12 minutes. The car arrived in 11. A dark sedan, a driver Nadia used regularly. The kind of arrangement that efficient professional people set up and maintain for exactly the occasions when you need someone reliable at 2 in the morning without asking. Sienna stood at the car door and looked at Knox. It was the look of someone who had several things to say and was doing triage in real time, which things mattered most, which could wait, which wouldn't survive the formality of a proper sentence. "I don't know how to," she stopped. "Thank you is not enough. But I don't have the right word for what more than that is." Knox held the car door. "Get some rest. You've got a long morning." "I do." She looked at him steadily. "Will you be at the hotel tomorrow?" He thought about it. His shift technically started at 4 p.m. He had a mountain of paperwork that was going to follow tonight's events and a HR process that he'd deal with when he dealt with it. Probably not. Things to sort out on my end. "I'd like to." She stopped again, and he could see her adjusting the sentence in real time, changing something. "When this is over, when the morning is done and the lawyers are finished, and whatever happens, happens. I'd like to say thank you properly. If that's something you'd allow." Knox looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's something I'd allow." She got in the car. He closed the door. The sedan pulled out of the lot and turned east, and Knox stood in the loading dock of an abandoned warehouse at 2:15 in the morning with broken ribs and someone else's radio clipped to his shirt and the slow-cooling aftermath of an adrenaline load that had been running for 6 hours. He called Tobin. "It's done," he said, a pause. Then, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done good work in the dark, "Yeah. I know, I've been watching the alerts." Another pause. "Knox, you okay?" "Ribs." "How bad?" "Bad enough. Not bad enough for tonight to matter." He sat down on the loading dock edge, which was something his ribs immediately complained about, and looked up at the sky, which was starting just barely, just at the edges to show the first gray suggestion that the night had a limit. "Thanks, Tobin. You'd have done it for me. I would. Get your ribs looked at." In the morning. Tobin made a sound that communicated what he thought of that timeline. "Then go see your kid, Knox." Knox ended the call. He sat there for another few minutes, not because he needed to, but because his body was requesting a brief interval before it was asked to do anything else, and he thought he'd earned the right to give it one. He thought about Mackie's drawing on the refrigerator, the big yellow sun and the 2 stick figures. He thought about how, when he picked her up tomorrow morning from his sister's place, and she asked why he hadn't come home last night, because she always noticed. She noticed everything. She was his daughter. He was going to have to come up with an explanation that was true, but also 7 years old-sized. He hadn't worked out what that was yet. He'd figure it out on the drive over. He stood up, accepted what his ribs said about that, and started walking. The boardroom at Whitmore Technologies occupied the northeast corner of the 14th floor and had a wall of windows that looked out over the city's east side, giving whoever sat at the head of the table a view that communicated something intentional about scale and perspective. The table sat 20. The chairs were the kind that cost more than they looked like they did, which was a design philosophy Sienna had always found slightly dishonest, but had inherited along with the rest of the furnishings when the company moved into the space 5 years ago. At 8:40 in the morning, Alistair Crane walked through the boardroom door. He was dressed in his best suit charcoal, well cut, the one he wore to presentations that mattered. He'd had it pressed. His tie was the muted burgundy one that projected authority without aggression, which was a calculation he'd made deliberately years ago and had never stopped making. His briefcase contained 3 printed copies of a prepared statement, a folder with selected financial documents, and a flash drive with a presentation he'd spent 2 weeks building. He looked, walking into that room, like exactly what he'd spent 9 years learning to look like, the steady, capable second-in-command who was, in this terrible moment of crisis, the person the company needed most. 5 directors were already seated. 2 were on the phone. 1 was speaking quietly to the company's general counsel. Alistair registered each of them in a single sweep and adjusted the specific expression on his face to the one that said, "I have been awake all night. I am worried. I am here. Thank you all for coming on short notice," he said, setting his briefcase at the chair to the right of the head of the table. Not the head, not yet. The optics of that mattered. I know this is not how any of us wanted this morning to start. Patricia Hensley, the board chair 71, sharp, the kind of woman who had been underestimated enough times that she'd stopped bothering to correct people and just let the outcomes speak, looked at him over the rims of her reading glasses. We're still waiting on 2 directors, of course. Alistair settled into the chair and opened his briefcase with the unhurried manner of someone who had the situation in hand. I want to start by saying that whatever we hear this morning, our first priority has to be the stability of the company. The Nova Bridge deal can be restructured. The timeline can be managed. What we can't afford. The boardroom door opened. Alistair looked up. The expression on his face did not change immediately. That was the thing about practiced people. The gap between what they feel and what they show had been worked on for so long that it operated independently, like a secondary system running alongside the primary one. His face stayed composed for nearly 3 full seconds. Then it changed. Sienna walked in. She was wearing clothes that were not the navy dress Nadia had arranged a change of clothes from Sienna's assistant Della, who had met them at Nadia's office at 3 in the morning, with a bag and a thermos of coffee, and the expression of someone who would have done considerably more if asked. The outfit was simple. Dark pants, a pale gray blouse, the kind of thing Sienna wore on long working days when she needed to move without thinking about what she had on. Her hair was not quite what it would have been if she'd slept. Her eyes were clear. She did not look like someone who had been missing. She looked like someone who had been working. Behind her, Knox came through the door carrying a laptop bag that belonged to Nadia's associate and a folder of printed materials that had been assembled in the previous 4 hours by a legal team operating on coffee and urgency. He was in clean clothes that didn't fit quite right, borrowed from a rack at the hotel's lost, and found that he'd raided at 6 a.m. because his own clothes from the night before were not presentable, and he was moving slightly stiffly on his left side, which he was controlling well enough that only someone watching for it would notice. Sienna noticed. She'd been watching for it since he'd met her and Nadia outside the building at 7:30, when Nadia had looked at him and said, with the directness of a lawyer who dealt only in factual realities, "You need to be seen by a doctor." And Knox had said after, and Nadia had looked at Sienna, and Sienna had looked at Knox, and nobody had pushed it because there wasn't time. The 5 directors at the table registered Sienna's entrance in various ways. Patricia Hensley's expression shifted toward something that was carefully controlled relief. The general counsel sat back in his chair. One of the directors on the phone ended his call abruptly. 2 directors, who had been leaning in the direction of Alistair's coming proposal, looked at each other with the specific uncertainty of people who had been about to make a commitment, and were now very glad they hadn't finished making it. Alistair had not spoken since the door opened. Sienna walked to the head of the table. She set her own folder down on it, looked at the chair that was hers, and did not sit down yet. She looked at the room first, each face, briefly, in the way she had always done at the start of important meetings, the habit of taking inventory before beginning. It was one of the first things a senior manager had noticed about her. Years ago, she counts the room before she speaks. Then she looked at Alistair. He was looking back at her with an expression that had finished composing itself into something that resembled measured concern. But the composure had arrived a beat too late, and they both knew it. "Good morning, Alistair," she said. "A beat, Sienna." His voice was steady. The board has been concerned. I've been trying to reach you since last night." "I know." She opened her folder. "You'll want to hear what I have to say before you continue." "Of course. I think we all want to understand what happened last." "I'm going to start with the Vane Strategic Solutions payments," Sienna said. The room went quiet in the specific way of rooms where the air quality has changed. Alistair's jaw did something brief and involuntary that he brought back under control almost instantly. Almost. I don't know what 3 payments, Sienna said. Possibly 4. Routed through 2 intermediary structures before reaching a personal holdings account that the Financial Crimes Unit linked to you at approximately 3 this morning. She looked at him without expression. You were in the hotel last night. Room 1407. You checked in at 4 p.m. and you called Silas Vane's operational number at 8:12 p.m. when my location was reported as uncertain. Patricia Hensley had taken her reading glasses off. She was watching Alistair with the attention of someone who had been on enough boards to recognize the specific stillness of a man who has been caught and is performing the calculation of whether to fight it or not. Alistair set both hands flat on the table. This is stopped. Start it again. Whatever you think you have, Sienna, I want to be very clear that last night you were missing. No one could reach you. The signing didn't happen. These are facts. They are. She reached into the folder and placed a document on the table. This is the payment record. Certified copy. Your external counsel will have received the source documentation from the Financial Crimes Unit by now, if they haven't already. She placed a second document beside it. These are the merger documents, the originals, from the secure server, certified by Nadia Reeves. And these, a third document, are the versions that were in the working file at the time I requested the consolidated review. The discrepancies are marked. A fourth document. This is the internal communication record from Alistair's corporate account showing 6 weeks of correspondence regarding my fitness for leadership with 2 of the directors at this table. Across the table, the 2 directors who had been leaning toward Alistair's proposal were now looking at the documents with the expressions of people who were actively reconstructing recent conversations in a new and unflattering light. And this, Sienna said, placing the last document, a printed summary of Tobin's evidence package, organized by Nadia's associate into clean, sourced pages, is the compiled record of the coordination between Alistair Crane, Silas Vane, and Marcus Hale, my former head of security, spanning approximately 6 weeks. It includes communication logs, payment records, and the tracking device reference that explains how a private contractor team knew my exact movements at the Alderton Grand last night. The room was completely still. Alistair looked at the documents on the table. Knox watched him look at them, not at Sienna, not at the board, at the papers themselves. And there was something in that moment, in the way a man looked at the physical evidence of his own planning laid out in front of him. That was more revealing than anything he said. It was the look of someone doing a final accounting and arriving at a number they couldn't argue with. I want to speak with my lawyer, Alistair said. That's your right, Sienna said. You should know that investigators are waiting outside this room, which is why I'd encourage you to be thoughtful about what you say between now and the time you make that call. She held his gaze for one more second, not with triumph, because there was nothing triumphant in her expression, just the flat and exhausted steadiness of someone who had been fighting all night for the right to stand in this room and say what she was saying. You were at my mother's funeral. Alistair said nothing. I just wanted to say that, Sienna said, out loud. So it was in the room. She picked up her folder, straightened it, and set it down again. Then she looked at Patricia Hensley. Patricia. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Patricia Hensley put her reading glasses back on. The meeting is called to order. Her voice was dry and precise, and carried the weight of someone who had navigated worse than this and knew how it was done. She looked at Alistair. Mr. Crane, I'm going to ask you to step outside. There are 2 investigators in the corridor who I understand have been waiting since 8 a.m. Alistair sat for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then with the particular compliance of a man who has arrived at the end of something and is choosing to walk out rather than be removed, he said, picked up his briefcase and walked to the door. He didn't look at Sienna when he passed her. He looked at the floor. Knox, standing near the side wall with Nadia's associate, watched him go. The door closed. The room held its breath for 2 seconds. Then Patricia Hensley turned to Sienna with the expression of a woman who had approximately 17 things to say and was selecting the most immediately useful. Tell me where the merger stands. Nova Bridge has the postponement request through external counsel. The 24-hour window gives us time to brief them on what happened and provide clean documentation. The deal is still viable. The underlying numbers are sound. The altered projections were cosmetic, not structural. Sienna pulled a chair out, but didn't sit yet, which Knox had noticed was something she did. She stood until she was ready to commit to a position. I'd like to conference in the Nova Bridge lead at 9 a.m. If the board is willing to convene a formal session,
The board is willing.
Patricia said, then I'd like to use the next 20 minutes to walk through the documentation. She looked at the assembled directors, and I'd like to say one thing first. She paused, choosing the words with the care of someone who knew the difference between what was effective and what was honest, and had decided that tonight they were the same thing. I understand that some of you were given information about my judgment and my fitness for leadership over the past several weeks. I understand that information came from someone you had reason to trust. I'm not going to ask you to apologize for considering it. I am going to ask you to evaluate what I put in front of you this morning on its merits, the same way I'd want you to evaluate anything else. She looked down the table. That's all I need from you. Just your honest reading of what's in front of you. Two of the directors nodded. One of them, the one Knox had seen on the phone when they came in, said, "That seems fair," in the tone of a man who is slightly ashamed of himself and expressing it the only way available at a board meeting. Sienna sat down. The next 2.5 hours were not simple. Knox knew, watching from his position near the side wall, that people who imagined corporate governance drama as a series of clean confrontations and decisive speeches had never been in a real boardroom for a real crisis. The actual thing was slower and more procedural and involved more document review than it looked like from the outside. Nadia Reeves arrived at 9:15, having come directly from a call with the lead Nova Bridge attorney, and she and Sienna moved through the documentation with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from a working relationship that had already been tested under pressure. There were questions, good ones, pointed ones, the kind of questions that boards were supposed to ask, and often didn't, and Sienna answered them straight, not perfectly. She acknowledged 2 places where the altered documents had moved through approval without triggering the review flag they should have triggered, and she said plainly that those were gaps in her process that she took responsibility for and would correct. She didn't minimize it. She also didn't collapse under it. At 10:45, the Nova Bridge conference call happened. Knox didn't hear most of it because he'd moved into the corridor at Nadia's suggestion to let the board and the legal team conduct the call without a hotel operations manager in the corner of the room. He sat in one of the chairs outside the boardroom door and looked at the carpet and thought about Mackie, who was at his sister's house, and who he'd spoken to briefly at 7 a.m., telling her he'd see her before lunch. It was approaching 11. He pulled out his phone and texted his sister, running a little late. Still by noon. She sent back, "She's asking about you. I told her you were working. She wants to know if you saved anybody." Knox looked at that for a moment. He typed back, "Tell her yes. She can ask me about it when I get there." The boardroom door opened at 11:20. Nadia came out first, saw Knox in the chair, and stopped. She looked at him with the expression of a lawyer taking inventory of a situation she hadn't had time to fully assess until now. "You should genuinely see a doctor. I know, the ribs, among other things. I know." She sat down in the chair beside him. The Nova Bridge call went well. They're satisfied with the explanation and the documentation. We're looking at a revised signing within the week. She paused. The board voted unanimously to reaffirm Sienna's authority. 2 of the directors who'd been receiving Alistair's briefings are embarrassed, is probably the word. They'll manage. Good. Nadia looked at him sideways. "She told me you have a daughter. Mackie. 7. She told me about the drawing on the refrigerator." Nadia was quiet for a moment. "I've known Sienna for 6 years. She's not easy to impress a beat." She was impressed. Knox didn't respond to that because he wasn't sure what to do with it. The morning had already contained more things he wasn't sure what to do with than he had capacity for. The boardroom door opened again and Sienna came out. She looked at Knox in the chair, and something in her face did the thing it had been doing periodically through the night, the brief, visible softening that happened when she was looking at something that was difficult to look at without. Acknowledging, and she was too honest to pretend not to acknowledge it. "The vote was unanimous," she said, "Nadia told me. The merger is back on track. She told me that too." Sienna looked at him for a moment. "You're in pain. Manageable. You've been saying that since the warehouse." "It's been true since the warehouse." She exhaled. "Is there someone to take you to?" "I'm fine. I'm going to pick up my daughter." He stood, slowly but without making a production of it. "You have a company to get back to." She nodded. She looked like someone who had won something that she wasn't ready to call a victory yet, because there were still too many loose edges, and the cost was still too immediate, and it would take some time before the winning was. The first thing she thought of, instead of the last. Knox understood that, had felt it before, after operations that ended the way they were supposed to and still left you, sitting in the quiet afterward, trying to account for everything that had happened to get there. Knox, she said. He stopped. When you pick up Maki, she said it carefully, like she was working out the exact right shape of what she meant. Will you tell her? She stopped. Tell her the person you helped says thank you. For sharing her dad. Knox looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. I'll tell her that. He walked to the elevator at the end of the hall and pressed the button and waited for it with his hands in the pockets of borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit, his ribs steady and constant and present, and the particular quiet of a long thing that was finally oversettling into him like weather. The elevator arrived. He stepped in, the doors closed. In the boardroom behind him, Sienna sat back down at the head of the table where her name was on the door and started making the calls that would put things back together. She had her company. She had her evidence. She had a merger to close and a leadership team to rebuild and a long accounting process ahead that would take months and would be genuinely difficult and would require her to be honest with herself about things she'd missed and trusted too quickly. She was already thinking about how to begin. And in a hotel room on the 14th floor of the Alderton Grand, Alistair Crane sat in a chair, facing two investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit, his briefcase open on the bed beside him, 3 printed copies of a statement that would not be delivered, a folder of documents that had been superseded, a flash drive that no longer mattered, and started the long, particular process of understanding that there was no version of the next conversation that ended the way he'd planned. Knox's car pulled out of the parking structure and headed east toward his sister's house and a 7-year-old who was going to ask him 12 questions before he got through the front door and was going to require, at some point before bedtime, a story about what her dad had been doing all night. He was still working out how to tell it in a way that was true and 7 years old sized. He had about 20 minutes to figure it out. That would have to be enough. Knox Bellamy asked 11 questions before Knox made it through his sister's front door, which was 1 fewer than he'd predicted and still more than he had immediate answers for. The first was whether he was okay, which she asked while looking at the way he was holding his left side, because she was 7 and observant in the specific way of children who had grown up paying close attention to one parent and had gotten very good at reading that one person's body. The second was whether he'd eaten breakfast. The 3rd through 8th were variations on what had happened and whether it was like the movies, and whether he'd had to fight anyone, and whether the bad guys went to jail, delivered in the rapid overlapping sequence of a child who generates questions faster than they can be answered, and doesn't particularly require the answers to arrive in order. Knox sat down on his sister Dana's couch and answered them one at a time, starting with the first. I'm okay. Yes, I ate. He hadn't, but he would. Something happened at work that took all night to sort out. The people causing the problem are dealing with the consequences now. He looked at her. No, it wasn't exactly like the movies. Yes, there was some fighting. Yes, the people who were doing wrong things are in trouble. Maki processed this. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch beside him, in the purple pajamas she'd apparently refused to change out of because Dana hadn't pushed it, her hair in the slightly destroyed braid from the night before. She looked at his left side. Does it hurt? Yes. A lot? Some. She leaned carefully against him on the right side, which he noticed, and which meant she'd already figured out which side to avoid, because she was that kind of kid, and put her head against his arm. Knox put his arm around her and looked at Dana, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee mug, and the expression of an older sister who had been worried and was now translating that worry into the practical language of food. I'm making eggs, Dana said. Don't argue with me. Knox didn't argue with her. He ate the eggs. He drank the coffee. He let Maki explain, at considerable length, the plot of the movie Dana had let her watch the night before, which appeared to involve animated dogs and a misunderstanding that took 90 minutes to resolve, and he listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who understood that this specific ordinary thing, this kitchen and this sister and this small person explaining a movie plot with complete earnestness, was the thing he'd been protecting when he was doing everything else. After breakfast, Dana drove them both home. She didn't ask Knox for details in front of Maki, and she didn't push for them in the car, which was one of the many reasons Knox had always been grateful for his sister's specific intelligence. She understood the difference between needing to know and needing to know right now. At home, Knox showered and changed and then drove himself to the urgent care clinic on Meridian which Maki attended with the focused concern of a child who had appointed herself responsible for ensuring her father did not minimize medical situations. The clinic doctor, a small, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, who had clearly heard every version of thought it would just resolve on its own, confirmed 2 cracked ribs, wrapped them with the kind of efficiency that communicated she'd done this many times before, and told Knox that the next 3 weeks were going to be uncomfortable and that he should treat that as a consequence of his choices. What kind of choices? Maki asked, from the chair in the corner where she'd been allowed to sit. Adult choices, Knox and Dr. Patel said simultaneously. On the drive home, Maki was quiet for about 4 blocks, which was unusual enough that Knox glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window with the specific inward expression of a child working through something she wasn't sure how to ask about. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, the person you helped. Are they okay?" Knox looked at the road. "Yes. She's okay," Maki repeated with the tone of someone filing information. "Was she scared? I think so. She didn't show it much." Maki considered this. "Was she nice?" Knox thought about Sienna standing in the electrical room with her jaw tight and her voice not breaking. Sienna in bare feet on the parking structure concrete, moving without complaint. Sienna looking at a board of directors and saying, "I just wanted to say that out loud." So it was in the room. "Yeah," he said. "She was. Are you going to see her again?" Knox didn't answer immediately, and the pause lasted long enough that Maki looked up at the rearview mirror and found his eyes there. He said, "Honestly, I don't know yet." Maki looked back out the window. After a moment, with the decisive simplicity of someone who has made a judgment and is done deliberating, "I think you should." Knox didn't answer that either, but something in his chest, separate from his ribs, did something that was not quite painful and not quite comfortable, the feeling of a door that had been closed for a long time being opened just enough to let the air in. The weeks that followed were the procedural aftermath of the kind of event that produces a great deal of paperwork and institutional process and very little of the dramatic clarity that the event itself had contained. Alistair Crane was formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, and corporate espionage. The charges were detailed and well-supported, built on the foundation of Tobin's evidence package and the Financial Crimes Unit's subsequent investigation, which had spent 3 weeks pulling on the threads Knox had identified and finding, as Sienna had suspected, that the Dreyfield Systems acquisition 2 years prior bore the same fingerprints. A second set of charges was being prepared in connection with that case. Marcus Hale surrendered his security license and cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. It came out in the depositions that Marcus had been approached by Alistair 14 months earlier, not approached abruptly, but slowly, through a series of conversations that had moved from legitimate professional consultation to something else so gradually that Marcus had not identified the specific moment of crossing until he was already across. This was not an excuse. Knox understood that clearly, and he thought Sienna did too. But it was an explanation of something of how people who are not essentially corrupt end up doing corrupt things, the slow erosion of incremental choices made under the pressure of money and loyalty to the wrong person. Silas Vane pleaded not guilty, which surprised no one, and was awaiting trial with bail conditions that effectively ended his operational capacity in the interim. 2 of his team members cooperated with prosecutors. 2 did not. The legal process would take time, which legal processes always did, and Sienna's lawyer Nadia had assembled the team to manage it with the steady thoroughness of someone building something that would hold. Knox's own involvement in the events of that night generated a formal interview process, with the Financial Crimes Unit that took 4 sessions spread over 2 weeks, and a separate review by the hotel's parent company that was more concerned with liability than with facts, but eventually concluded, carefully and with considerable corporate hedging, that Knox had acted in accordance with his professional judgment under extraordinary circumstances. He was offered a commendation, which he declined, and a bonus, which he also declined. And eventually the hotel's general manager, a man named Firth, who was decent enough, sat across from Knox in his own office and said, "I genuinely don't know what I'm supposed to do with you." Knox said, "You don't have to do anything." Firth looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" Knox thought about it. Eventually, he said, which was the honest answer. He went back to work. His ribs healed on the scheduled doctor. Patel had predicted uncomfortable, then less uncomfortable, then present but manageable, then mostly fine with specific exceptions. He worked his shifts. He sorted the paperwork. He picked Maki up from school. He made dinner. He listened to the dog movie plot a second time because Maki believed some details hadn't been adequately covered the first time. The ordinary machinery of the life he'd built kept running, and he let it because it was a good life and he'd built it deliberately, and there was nothing wrong with it. It was just that some doors, once opened even a little, let in a draft that was hard to unfeel. Sienna came to the hotel on a Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks after the night of the signing gala. Knox knew she was coming because he texted him the day before on his personal phone, the number she'd used when she'd borrowed it in the sublevel corridor. The text had said, "I'd like to come by tomorrow if that's all right." Not for any particular reason, just to say the things I should have said properly when I had more than 30 seconds. And Knox had looked at it for a while and typed back, "That's all right." He was doing his afternoon walkthrough of the service levels when she found him. Not the ballroom level, a different part of the building, the unremarkable back-of-house area where the real operations happened, the part guests never saw. She came through the staff entrance with a visitor badge that the front desk had issued her, and she was wearing the same kind of simple workday clothes she'd worn to the boardroom: dark pants, a jacket, practical shoes, and she was alone. No security detail, no assistant, no entourage of any kind. Knox saw her before she saw him, which gave him about 5 seconds to just look at her as a person rather than as a situation to manage. She was walking with the same deliberate forward energy she'd had in the service corridors 5 weeks ago, slightly compressed now because she was in civilian normal mode rather than crisis running mode, but recognizable. She was looking for him specifically, not for the hotel generally, and she found him when she came around the corner near the supply room and pulled up short. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific mild awkwardness of two people who had met under extreme circumstances and were now encountering each other in the absence of those circumstances for the first time, and were both figuring out what that was. "I thought there might be a more dramatic location," Sienna said. "For the proper thank you." Knox looked around at the supply room corridor. "This is where I am. It's fine." She smiled, not the professional version, not the composed CEO version, just an actual smile, slightly crooked, the kind people produce when something is genuinely a little funny. "It's very you, actually." They ended up in the break room at the end of the hall because it had chairs and a coffee machine, and Knox made coffee that was objectively mediocre, and Sienna drank it without complaint, which he noted. She told him about the merger first, because that was the thing that had context and structure and was easier to explain. The Nova Bridge signing had happened 8 days after the original date, in a smaller conference room with a reduced guest list and no gala, which Sienna said was a considerable improvement. The deal had closed. The integration work had started. She'd spent the first week fielding calls from investors, who'd heard various versions of what had happened and needed the actual version, which took time but was the kind of work she was good at: managing information, correcting narrative, being precise about what was true. The board has been, she paused, choosing. They've been fair. Some of them are embarrassed about being played, which makes them either defensive or overcompensating. Patricia Hensley is neither. She told me that the whole situation identified gaps in our governance structure that we needed to address anyway, and that we should treat it as a stress test that we passed, barely, and build from there. "Good advice," Knox said. "It is. She's good." Sienna wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I've been thinking about why I didn't see it. With Alistair." She looked at the cup, not at Knox. I think I knew something was off, maybe 3 or 4 months ago. There were small things. Moments where something he said didn't quite match something I remembered. And I explained them. I rationalized them." She paused. 9 years builds a lot of explanations. Knox said, "You trusted someone who had earned trust. That's not the same as being foolish." "It's not," she agreed. "But it's also not nothing. I should have looked harder." She said it simply, without the excessive self-flagellation that some people use to perform accountability without actually sitting with it. She meant it as a fact. Something to carry forward, not something to collapse under. Knox respected that. He understood that distinction from his own experience, the difference between accountability that changes you and guilt that just weighs on you. He'd spent a long time working out which one was useful and which one was just a different kind of hiding. "How are the ribs?" she asked, shifting, looking at him. "Healed. Mostly." He moved his left shoulder slightly to demonstrate range of motion. "Dr. Patel said 3 weeks. She was accurate. Good." Sienna set her cup down. "Knox, I want to say the actual thing." She looked at him steadily, And he recognized the look. It was the same look she'd had in the electrical room when she'd decided to be honest about something difficult. That night you didn't know me. You had absolutely no stake in any of it. You had a daughter at home and a life you'd built specifically to stay safe and contained. And you walked away from all of that for 8 hours on the basis of 2 words from a stranger. 300 words, Knox said. We talked for a while. She almost smiled but held it. You know what I mean. I do. I keep thinking about what it cost you. What it could have cost you. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to thank someone for something like that. I've been trying to figure it out for 5 weeks, and I've decided you can't. You just have to carry it as a debt you can't repay and try to be worth the cost. Knox looked at her. You were already worth the cost before I knew anything about you. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked away, which was the most unguarded thing he'd seen her do in any context, because Sienna Whitmore did not generally look away from things. Your daughter, she said, Maki. You told me she's 7. She is. What she's like. Knox thought about how to compress someone's whole person into an answer. She asks questions faster than they can be answered. She starts stories in the middle and works outward from there. She chose the dog movie at her aunt's house over the adventure movie because, and I quote, the dog looked sad on the cover, and I wanted to make sure it was okay by the end. He paused. It was okay by the end. Sienna's expression had gone soft in a way that she wasn't controlling. She sounds like someone worth cracking ribs for. She's the reason for most decisions I've made in the last 4 years, Knox said, including the ones that look like they have nothing to do with her. Sienna understood that. He could see her understand it the way it landed, and connected to something she'd already been thinking about. She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, I'd like to meet her. If that's something that makes sense. Not she adjusted. Not with any expectation attached to it. Just because she's someone who matters to you, and you matter to me now, and I think that means something, even if I'm not sure yet what shape it takes. Knox sat with that for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He thought about Maki in the rearview mirror 5 weeks ago, her eyes finding his, I think you should. She already has opinions about you, he said. Sienna blinked. She does. She asked if you were nice. I said yes. She asked if I was going to see you again. He paused. She told me I should. Sienna looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, not the boardroom steadiness, not the crisis composure, not the careful professional warmth. Something more private than all of those, something that existed underneath the layers people construct when they've been running hard and alone for a long time and have gotten very practiced at not needing things. What did you say? I said I didn't know yet. And now? He looked at her. Now I think she was right. The following months were not a montage. They were not a clean progression from one emotional beat to the next. They were real, which meant they were complicated, and sometimes awkward, and occasionally involved misunderstandings that had to be worked out through actual conversation rather than resolved by circumstance. Sienna met Maki 3 weeks after the break room conversation, at a Saturday afternoon at a park near Knox's house. That was Knox's idea, because a park was neutral territory and low stakes. And if anything was uncomfortable, they could just look at the geese and change the subject. Maki arrived with opinions already formed. She had done some research, which at 7 meant she had asked her dad several questions and drawn some conclusions from the answers, and she interrogated Sienna about the dog movie within 45 seconds of meeting her. Apparently because Sienna worked in technology, and Maki had a theory that people who worked with computers probably had not seen enough movies about animals. Sienna had not, in fact, seen the dog movie. Maki found this both disappointing and correctable. By the time they left the park 2 hours later, Sienna had a movie recommendation, and Maki had decided, with the decisive simplicity that characterized all of her important conclusions, that Sienna was acceptable. Knox knew this because Maki communicated it to him directly on the drive home, in the unfiltered way of children who have not yet learned to make their judgments private. She's okay, Dad. She listened when I talked. She's good at that, Knox said. She looked sad sometimes when she thought we weren't looking. Knox glanced in the rearview mirror. Yeah. Is that because of what happened? The bad things at work? Some of it. Some of it is just she's been running hard for a long time. That catches up with people. Maki looked out the window. Could invite her for dinner sometime. So she doesn't have to be somewhere alone. Knox said, yeah, we could do that. They did. Not immediately and not constantly. The rhythm of it built gradually, in the way real things build, with gaps and adjustments, and some dinners that were easy and some that weren't. Sienna was not a person who found ordinariness natural. She'd spent so many years in the high-velocity environment of building a company that the slower pace of a weeknight dinner in a small kitchen with a 7-year-old narrating the events of her school day required an active recalibration that she was honest about and not always graceful about. She showed up sometimes still carrying the weight of whatever the day at the office had been distracted in the specific way of people whose thoughts are still running even when their body has arrived somewhere, and Knox learned to recognize it. And Maki, without being told, learned to give it the space it needed by simply continuing to talk about whatever she'd been talking about until the distraction receded. Sienna learned things too. She learned that Knox cooked competently but not ambitiously, and that Maki had deep opinions about this. She learned that Knox's silences were not distance, they were him, the same way Maki's questions were her. She learned that the man who had moved through a dark warehouse, incapacitating professional operatives with quiet precision, was the same man who sat on the edge of a 7-year-old's bed and told stories about a character named Captain Stubbs, who had improbable adventures and always found his way home, and that those two things were not contradictions, they were the same person from different angles. She learned that she had been lonely for longer than she'd acknowledged, in the way that very busy people are lonely, not dramatically, not consciously, but in the accumulation of evenings and weekends where the only voice in the space was their own. Knox learned things about himself too, which was harder and took longer, and was the kind of learning that happens when someone else's presence makes your own assumptions visible. He'd built his life around smallness as a form of protection. Not smallness as in limitation, he'd been deliberate and capable, and had raised a daughter he was genuinely proud of, but smallness as in boundaries, as in managed exposure, as in never letting anything get important enough to break him if it went wrong. He understood, eventually, with the slow honesty of someone who has been thinking about something for months without quite naming it, that this was not just grief management. It was fear. The fear that the man who'd made the call that cost 2 people their lives did not deserve a large life. That the right punishment was to keep the borders narrow. He told Sienna this one evening on the back step of the house after Maki was asleep. He said it plainly, without theater, the way he'd always said things that needed to land without decoration. He said he'd been living like someone serving a sentence he'd given himself, and he wasn't sure when he'd decided that was the right response to what had happened, but he was starting to think it wasn't. Sienna listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The men who didn't come home," she said. "Do you think they'd want you to live like that?" Knox looked at the dark yard. "No. Would you want that for someone you'd lost? That they'd spend the rest of their life keeping themselves small in penance for an impossible decision?" He was quiet for a long moment. The night was still and the yard smelled like cut grass from that afternoon, and somewhere in the distance a car passed on the street and the sound of it faded slowly. "No," he said again. "I wouldn't." "Then you know what to do with that," she said simply. She didn't push beyond that. She said the thing that was true and let him carry it himself, which was the right call, and he knew it was the right call. And the fact that she knew how to make it told him something about her that added to the long list of things he was learning. It took Knox about 6 more weeks, not because the decision was complicated, but because he was a man who moved deliberately and didn't act on things until he was certain, which was a quality that had served him in most contexts and occasionally frustrated people who moved faster. When he was certain, he said so. Not with elaborate setup or occasion, but on a Tuesday night in his own kitchen after Maki was in bed, because that was where they were, and Knox had stopped waiting for better conditions. He said, "I don't want to keep being careful with this." Sienna looked at him from across the kitchen counter. "I don't either. I want to be honest about what it is." "Yes, it's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not nothing." He came around the counter and she stayed where she was, and that was enough for what it needed to be, which was the beginning of something that both of them had been moving toward with varying degrees of acknowledgement for months. Alistair Crane was convicted 14 months later on 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. The Dreyfield Systems-related charges resulted in a second conviction 2 months after the first. He was sentenced to 7 years, of which he would serve a minimum of 5. Silas Vane's trial concluded 6 weeks after Alistair's, and Vane received 9 years on the more serious charges, given the nature of the operational activity he'd directed. Marcus Hale, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors and whose role had been primarily one of omission and intelligence sharing rather than active participation, received a suspended sentence and 400 hours of community service. Knox heard about this and thought about it, and decided he understood it without being fully comfortable with it, which was probably the honest response. Whitmore Technologies' merger with NovaBridge was the success the numbers had predicted. The integration took 18 months and was difficult in the specific ways that large integrations were always difficult personnel decisions, system conflicts, cultural friction between teams, and Sienna managed it with the kind of hard-won pragmatism of someone who had learned, at some cost, the difference between trusting structure and trusting people. She built a new leadership team slowly and with more verification than she'd done before, not out of paranoia but out of the recognition that she'd let comfort substitute for diligence, and that the cost of that mistake was something she was still paying in other people's consequences as much as her own. She also built a new governance framework with Patricia Hensley's guidance, an independent audit structure, rotation requirements for senior executive oversight, a whistleblower protection system with actual teeth. It took 2 years to fully implement and was reported on in 2 industry publications as a model for mid-market tech companies, neither of which mentioned why the framework had been necessary. Sienna was fine with that. The point was the building, not the credit. Knox left the Alderton Grand Hotel 12 months after the night of the signing gala. He gave 4 weeks' notice and left on good terms with Firth, who had eventually decided that the right thing to do with Knox Bellamy was simply to appreciate having had him for as long as he'd stayed. Knox's last shift ended the same as all his other shifts, a walkthrough, a handoff, a conversation with the night crew about operational details that would matter to them and no one else. He drove home and ate a late dinner and went to bed without ceremony. 3 weeks later, he opened Bellamy Security Consulting, operating out of an office that was too large for one person, and which Maki decorated with a drawing she made specifically for the occasion, a building with a big door and a stick figure standing in front of it, labeled, in her now slightly less crooked 8-year-old handwriting, Dad's Work. The consultancy specialized in internal threat assessment for mid-market companies, the specific kind of vulnerability that came not from external hackers or corporate rivals, but from within, from the slow erosion of accountability and the gaps that formed when organizations trusted structure more than they verified it. Knox was very good at this, which was not entirely surprising, given that he had a particular understanding of how those gaps looked from the inside. Whitmore Technologies was his first client, which Sienna had proposed, and Knox had accepted with the caveat that the engagement be run at market rate and subject to the same independent review as any other vendor, because he was not interested in favors and she was not interested in offering them. It was, from the beginning, a clean and professional arrangement. It was also, from the beginning, the work of 2 people who knew each other very well and trusted each other's judgment completely, and that combination produced results that were good for the company and good for the consultancy, and allowed both of them to be exactly what they were without having to be something else. Tobin Shaw joined the consultancy as a part-time technical partner 6 months in. He came on at his own initiative, showing up unannounced at the office one afternoon, and presenting himself with the directness of a man who had decided something and was not interested in prolonging the sales process. "I've been doing this kind of work freelance for 8 years, and I'm tired of doing it alone," he said. "You need someone who can run the digital side. I need someone worth working for." He looked around the office at Maki's drawing on the wall. "The drawing's a good sign." Knox shook his hand. The company grew steadily over the next 2 years, not explosively, not in the way that generated press releases and investor interest, but in the sustainable way of a business built on genuine competence and honest referrals, which was the only kind of growth Knox was interested in managing. He hired carefully. He turned down engagements that didn't fit, which was something that some potential clients found frustrating, and which Knox was comfortable with. He had learned the cost of operating outside your actual capabilities and had no interest in relearning it. Knox and Sienna married on a Saturday in late October, 14 months after that Tuesday in the kitchen. The ceremony was small, 30 people, a rented space in a garden that looked good in October, a judge who did a clean and brief officiation without religious framing. Dana cried and attempted to conceal it and failed. Tobin wore a suit that was visibly borrowed and didn't comment on this. Nadia Reeves sat in the front row with the composed satisfaction of someone who felt that certain outcomes were correctly reached. Maki was the flower girl, which she had requested with considerable specificity about the particulars, and she performed the role with the same earnest thoroughness she applied to everything she decided mattered. She walked down the aisle, with her basket of petals and the focused expression of someone executing a task they've rehearsed. And then she sat down next to Dana and turned to watch Knox standing at the front of the space, and whatever she saw in her father's face made her reach over and take Dana's hand without looking, which was the moment Dana stopped pretending she wasn't crying. After, Sienna found Knox standing slightly apart from the gathered guests, not antisocial, just stepping back for a moment, which was something he did and which she'd learned to recognize as the way he processed things rather than avoided them. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the garden and the people in it, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Sienna said, "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "That night. In the ballroom, she looked out at the garden. I didn't know you. I had no real reason to think you'd help. And I almost didn't say it. I almost walked past you and found a different exit, or called someone on my phone, or just did something else." She paused. "I almost didn't say it." Knox was quiet for a moment. He thought about the ballroom, the chandeliers and the champagne, and the three people with their practiced stillness, waiting. The woman in the navy dress moving past him, with 2 words delivered under the noise of the room, like something she'd been holding her breath to say. "But you did," he said. "I did." She turned and looked at him. "I had about 3 seconds to decide, and I looked at you, and I decided. I don't fully understand why." Knox looked back at her. "What did you see?" She thought about it, genuinely thought, not reaching for a polished answer. "Someone who was paying attention," she said finally. "Not to the event. To the room. The way you were watching it, I don't know. I thought that someone who watched things that carefully might be someone who could be trusted with something that mattered." Knox held her gaze. "That's a significant amount of inference from one observation."
"I know."
She almost smiled. It worked out. He kissed her, which was not something he did with an audience normally, and which the 30 people in the garden registered with varying degrees of warmth, and which Maki observed from across the space with the satisfied expression of someone whose opinion had, once again, proven correct. There is a version of this story that wants to resolve cleanly into lesson, wants to point at Knox or Sienna or Maki and say, "See, this is what the right choices produce." But that's not quite honest, and Knox Bellamy had never had much patience for things that weren't quite honest. The truth was more complicated and more human than a lesson. The truth was that Knox had not been redeemed by a dramatic night, or by love, or by finding a new purpose. He had been, slowly and imperfectly, working toward a life that fit him, one that didn't require him to be smaller than he was or to carry more than he'd earned carrying. That work had started before the ballroom and would continue after it. The night with Sienna had not fixed anything. It had interrupted a pattern of contraction, the slow habit of keeping everything close and low and survivable. It had reminded him, in the specific way that only actual stakes remind you, that the things worth protecting are worth the risk of protecting them, and that a man who has something worth fighting for is not obligated to live as if he doesn't. Sienna carried her own truths. The merger had been won and the company was stable, and Alistair was in a federal facility in Pennsylvania, and the altered documents were long since corrected and accounted for. But she also knew that she had missed things, had been too comfortable, too trusting of surfaces, too willing to let competence substitute for scrutiny. That knowledge was not comfortable, and she didn't want it to be. It sat alongside the good things as a permanent counterweight, a reminder that the cost of insufficient attention was paid by other people as much as yourself. And Maki grew and asked questions and drew pictures and moved through the world with a specific combination of sensitivity and directness that would, Knox suspected, make her someone considerable when she was grown. She had a mother figure who treated her opinions as worth hearing, and who had not tried to replace anything or compete with anything, but had simply shown up with consistency and care, and the willingness to watch a dog movie and actually cry at the end because, as it turned out, Sienna Whitmore had never learned to protect herself from animated animal movies the way she'd learned to protect herself from everything else. Some losses don't come back. Knox knew that, and had always known it, and had spent 4 years treating it as an argument for keeping his world small. He understood, eventually, that it wasn't. Loss didn't argue for smallness, it argued for paying attention to what remained, for treating the present with the gravity that impermanence actually demanded. The men who hadn't come home would not have wanted him to live half a life in penance. He knew that. He'd always known it. He just needed something to make him act on it. In the garden, after the ceremony, Maki appeared at his elbow with the directness of a child who has found the adult she was looking for and does not intend to lose them again. "Dad," she said. Yeah. Is this the part where we eat cake? Knox looked at Sienna, who looked back at him with the particular warmth of someone who had been holding something good and fragile for a long time and had finally found somewhere safe to put it down. Yeah, he said, this is that part. And it was not perfect, and it was not the end of difficulty or uncertainty or the work that life required, but it was real, and it was theirs. And on a late October afternoon in a garden with 30 people and one child who had decided everything was going to be fine, that was more than enough.